The rain came down in sheets that seemed to melt the city into a blur of shadows and neon. Gotham's towering skyline loomed over everything, a grim reminder of the weight this city pressed onto its people. I stood there on the edge of a skyscraper, the cold wind cutting through my jacket. The faint hum of the city below barely registered as I stared into the darkness. It wasn't the criminals in the alleys or the chaos on the streets that haunted me tonight. It was him, my brother, a brother I never knew I had until Batman dropped the bombshell. "He's at the Gotham orphanage," Batman had said, his voice as unyielding as ever. "I thought you should know." I didn't ask why he waited so long to tell me. It didn't matter. What mattered was the storm it stirred inside me. I'd spent my life alone, hardened by the streets and the horrors that came with them. But now, there was this fragile connection, a thread tying me to a kid I'd never met. A kid who had no idea his brother was the Red Hood. I'd been wrestling with the idea of visiting him for days. Part of me wanted to see him, to protect him. But the other part, the darker, more honest part, knew the kind of life I led. People like me didn't get to have family. Family became leverage. Family got hurt. Still, I couldn't resist. Tonight, I made my choice. I'd see him just once, from the shadows. He'd never even know I was there. The Gotham orphanage was a crumbling relic from another era. A place where hope had long since died. I slipped in through the roof, moving silently through the dark halls. Batman had given me all the information I needed. His name, his room number. I navigated the maze of corridors until I reached the door. My heart pounded in a way I wasn't used to. I'd faced death 100 times without flinching. But this was different. Then I heard it. A scream, high-pitched and raw with terror, tore through the door. My instincts took over. I threw myself at the door, but it wouldn't budge. The screams turned into desperate pleas for help, and something in my chest twisted. I slammed into the door again and again until it finally gave way. Inside, the scene was chaos. My brother lay crumpled on the floor, blood pooling beneath him. Over him crouched a figure, grotesque and unnatural. Pale, deathly white face with hollow black eyes and a carved smile. A smile that didn't belong to anything human. The figure turned to me, tilting its head in mock curiosity. "Who the hell are you?" I barked, raising my weapon. The thing didn't flinch. It spoke in a voice so flat, so devoid of life, it sent chills down my spine. "Jeff." Before I could react, Jeff, the thing, whatever it was, disappeared into the shadows. I dropped to my knees beside my brother, shaking him, pleading for him to wake up. But he was gone. His lifeless eyes stared past me, and the world seemed to tilt. I turned back, roaring in fury. But Jeff was gone. The room was empty except for the lingering scent of something foul, metallic and decayed. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. I didn't have time. I fled the way I came, my chest burning with rage and grief. The next few days passed in a haze. Batman took care of the arrangements for the funeral. I couldn't bring myself to attend. I stayed hidden in the shadows, watching from a distance as strangers buried my brother. And I made a promise that would become my only reason to keep breathing. Jeff was going to pay. I threw myself into the hunt, tearing through Gotham's underbelly like a man possessed. Every criminal, every informant, every lowlife I found, I squeezed them for information. But Jeff was a ghost. No one had seen him, no one knew where he came from or where he went. And yet the murders continued. Each one marked by the same grotesque calling card. "Go to sleep," scrawled on the walls in blood. Weeks turned into months. My obsession grew, consuming everything else. I barely slept, barely ate. All that mattered was finding him. Then, one night, fate finally threw me a bone. I was perched on the roof of a dilapidated building in the Narrows, scanning the streets below. That's when I saw him. That face. That sickening grin. Jeff slipped into a house through the back door, moving like a shadow. My pulse quickened. This was it. I descended silently, entering the house the same way he had. The air inside was suffocating, thick with the stench of rot and something acrid. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and the dim light from a single flickering bulb cast long, twitching shadows. I moved carefully, every muscle in my body coiled like a spring. The sound of muffled crying reached my ears. I followed it to a door at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I could see him. Jeff stood over a young girl, his knife glinting in the dim light. He was whispering something to her, but I couldn't make out the words. Kicked the door open, my gun drawn. Get away from her, you sick freak. Jeff turned slowly, that carved grin never wavering. The girl scrambled away, her sobs filling the room. Jeff's black eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time, I felt it. A cold, creeping dread that clawed at my insides. You, he said, his voice dripping with mockery. You're late. I didn't wait. I fired, the gunshots deafening in the small room. But Jeff moved impossibly fast, dodging each shot with inhuman grace. He lunged at me, the knife slashing through the air. I barely dodged, the blade grazing my arm. The pain was sharp, but it fueled my rage. We fought like animals, the room becoming a blur of violence. Jeff's movements were unnatural, erratic, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. But I didn't back down. My fists connected with his face, his ribs, but he didn't react. It was like hitting a mannequin. Finally, I managed to pin him against the wall, my arm pressing against his throat. Why? Why did you kill him? I roared. Jeff's grin widened. Because it's fun. Before I could react, he brought his knee up, slamming it into my gut. I staggered back, and he vanished into the shadows once more. I searched the house, tearing through every room, but he was gone. The girl was safe, but my vengeance was stolen from me yet again. I stood there in the wreckage of that house, my blood pounding in my ears. Jeff was still out there, still killing. But I swore to myself, next time he wouldn't escape. Next time I'd make him pay. The memory of his face was seared into my mind, those pale, hollow eyes and that grotesque grin carved into his flesh. Because it's fun, he had said, his voice devoid of humanity. That single sentence echoed endlessly in my head, fueling my rage and twisting my grief into something unrecognizable. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my brother lying lifeless on the floor, his blood pooling beneath him. I'd fought countless enemies, taken down monsters in human skin, and done things I'd rather forget. But this was different. This was personal. The city buzzed with news of Jeff the killer's latest atrocities. The newspapers ran lurid headlines. Another family butchered in Gotham's Narrows. The television anchors reported the grisly details in their detached tones, their faces pale under studio lights. I stopped watching, stopped reading. All it did was bring me back to that night in the orphanage. Back to my failure. I became a creature of the night, a shadow haunting Gotham's filthiest corners. I didn't eat. I didn't sleep. I didn't live. Every waking moment was dedicated to finding him. I scoured alleyways, abandoned buildings, and the underbelly of the city where light dared not reach. I shook down informants and lowlifes, squeezed them for scraps of information. But Jeff was like smoke, slipping through my grasp no matter how tightly I tried to hold on. I started tracing his past, desperate for answers. The schools he'd attended, the bullies he'd fought, the house where he had supposedly killed his own family. I learned it all. I staked out that house for days, hoping he'd return to the scene of his first crime. But he never did. It was as though he had no past, no roots. Just a phantom that materialized to kill and disappeared just as easily. When I tracked down his old classmates, they offered me nothing but whispers of urban legends and half-truths. They spoke of a boy driven mad by bullying, by cruelty. But that didn't explain the thing I'd fought, that inhuman speed, that unnerving resilience. Jeff wasn't human anymore, if he ever had been. Exhaustion was my constant companion. I pushed myself beyond my limits, my mind fraying at the edges. Finally, after a particularly grueling night of chasing shadows and finding nothing, I returned to my hideout, a forgotten loft in the heart of Gotham's industrial district. The air inside was stale, the windows covered in grime. Maps and newspaper clippings littered the floor, pinned to walls with red string connecting every victim to Jeff's bloody trail. It was a shrine to obsession, and I was its priest. I slumped into the rickety chair at my desk, my head in my hands. My thoughts raced, but they went nowhere. I had no leads, no plan, no way to end this. And worse, a sickening thought had begun to creep into my mind. What if Jeff couldn't be killed? He moved like something out of a nightmare, dodging bullets and shrugging off blows that would shatter any man. Even if I found him, how could I stop him? The weight of it all pressed down on me, dragging me into a restless, fitful sleep. My dreams were a chaotic blur of blood and screams, of my brother's lifeless eyes staring into mine. Then suddenly, I was jarred awake by the sound of shattering glass. My eyes snapped open, and the adrenaline hit me like a freight train. The room was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the street lamp outside. First, I thought I was imagining things, my mind playing tricks on me after days without rest. But then I saw him. Jeff. He stood there, silhouetted against the broken window, his pale face illuminated by the faint light. His grin was wider than ever, stretching impossibly across his face. His hollow black eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a cold dread crawl up my spine. "Go to sleep," he whispered, his voice a sick parody of gentleness. I barely had time to react before he lunged at me, the glint of his knife catching the light. I rolled out of the chair just as the blade came down, sinking into the wood where my chest had been a moment earlier. The fight was immediate and brutal. I swung at him, connecting with his jaw, but he didn't flinch. It was like hitting a statue. Jeff moved with an unnatural speed, his body twisting and contorting as though his joints bent in ways they shouldn't. He slashed at me and I barely dodged, the blade grazing my arm and sending a sharp pain shooting through me. Blood trickled down my sleeve. But I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The fight raged through the room, knocking over furniture and sending papers flying. I managed to land a few more punches, but they seemed to do nothing. Jeff's grin never wavered, his black eyes staring into mine with something almost like amusement. "Why did you kill him?" I roared, my voice hoarse with rage. Jeff tilted his head, his grin somehow widening. "Because it's fun," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. That was it. The dam broke. I charged at him, tackling him to the ground. We grappled, rolling across the floor, his knife flashing dangerously close to my throat. Finally, I managed to pin him, my forearm pressed against his neck. But before I could do anything, he laughed. a chilling, hollow sound that made my blood run cold. "You can't stop me," he whispered, his voice so quiet it was almost lost in the chaos. Then, with a burst of inhuman strength, he threw me off him and disappeared into the shadows. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding, but he was gone. The room was silent except for my ragged breathing. The broken window let in a cold breeze, carrying with it the faint, metallic smell of blood. I stood there, shaken and bleeding, staring at the spot where he'd been. He'd come for me. He'd found me. And he'd let me live. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel. Fear. Not for myself, but for everyone else. Jeff wasn't just a killer. He was something else entirely. Something unstoppable.